What happens when the most advanced warrior in the galaxy meets a species he considers primitive? Commander Zefkari had conquered 17 worlds, his battlesuit had never been breached, and his reputation struck fear across star systems. Earth was supposed to be just another easy conquest, a backwater planet with soft, weak creatures who had barely reached their own moon. But sometimes, the smallest hands carry the greatest surprises. Sometimes, innocence holds power that experience cannot comprehend. And sometimes, a single moment between a terrifying alien warrior and a curious human child changes the fate of two entire species forever. This is the story of how the hegemony learned that humanity's greatest weapon was never their technology, their military, or their governments. It was something far more dangerous, something that no amount of armor could protect against, something that could crack even the most advanced battlesuit in the galaxy. The child's name was Emma. She was 7 years old, and she was about to rewrite the rules of intergalactic warfare with nothing but her bare hands and a heart that refused to see enemies where others saw monsters. The war drums of the hegemony echoed across the void as their massive dreadnought descended through Earth's atmosphere like a metallic storm cloud. Commander Zefkari stood at the observation deck, his forearms crossed behind his back, watching the blue and green world grow larger beneath his ship. The planet looked so peaceful, so utterly defenseless. His mandibles clicked in what passed for amusement among his species. "Surface scans complete, Commander," reported Lieutenant Vaxthul from the tactical station. "Population centers identified. Military installations are primitive. Their most advanced weapons appear to be chemical-based projectile systems and some basic energy weapons. Nothing that could penetrate even our standard infantry armor." Zefkari's 8 eyes focused on the data streaming across his personal display. The humans had managed to put a few small stations in orbit around their moon and had established some basic colonies on nearby celestial bodies, but their technology was laughably outdated. They still used combustion engines for most of their transportation. Their computers were massive, inefficient things that would have been considered obsolete by hegemony standards 3,000 years ago. "What about their defensive capabilities?" he asked, though he already knew the answer would disappoint him. "Minimal, sir. Some atmospheric aircraft, ground-based missile systems, and what appear to be primitive energy shields around their major population centers. Our preliminary assessment suggests we could conquer this entire world with a single assault battalion." The commander's massive frame, nearly 3 meters tall and covered in the finest battle armor the hegemony had ever produced, turned away from the viewport. His suit was a masterpiece of engineering, forged from metals harder than diamond and powered by a miniaturized star. It had been blessed by the war priests of Kethmoran and inscribed with the names of every world he had conquered. 17 worlds had fallen before him. Their defenders had thrown everything they had against his armor, and none had so much as left a scratch. "Too easy," he muttered in the clicking, harsh language of his people. "I had hoped these humans would provide at least some entertainment. The reports suggested they were warriors." "Sir, intelligence indicates they do have a strong warrior culture," Vaxthal replied carefully. "They have engaged in constant warfare among their own kind for thousands of years. Their history is filled with conflicts and battles." Zefkari's mandibles clicked again, this time with contempt. Fighting among themselves with primitive weapons hardly qualifies as warrior culture. A true warrior faces the unknown, conquers the unconquerable, and stands against impossible odds. These creatures surrender their own people to slavery, fight over patches of dirt, and worship invisible gods. They are not warriors. They are barely evolved animals. The dreadnought's massive engines began their descent toward the surface. The plan was simple, and it worked on every other world the hegemony had encountered. Land in the heart of their largest population center, deploy overwhelming force, and demand immediate surrender. Those who resisted would be eliminated as examples. Those who submitted would be processed for usefulness. The strong would become labor. The intelligent would become technicians, and the rest would be disposed of efficiently. As they approached the surface, Zefkari reviewed the intelligence reports once more. The humans called their world Earth, and their largest population center in the target zone was something called New York City. Over 8 million beings lived there, crammed together in primitive vertical structures made of steel and glass, perfect for a demonstration of hegemony superiority. The ship landed in what the humans called Central Park, its massive bulk-crushing trees that had stood for centuries and leaving a crater nearly a kilometer wide. The impact sent shockwaves through the surrounding area, shattering windows and triggering what the humans called earthquakes. Within minutes, their primitive emergency response teams were racing toward the landing site, their sirens wailing like the death cries of wounded animals. "Deploy Assault Team Alpha," Zeth-Kari commanded. "Standard intimidation formation. I want their leaders here within 1 hour to discuss terms of surrender." The massive cargo bay doors of the dreadnought opened with a hiss of escaping atmosphere, and 20 hegemony assault troopers emerged. Each stood nearly 2.5 meters tall, their armor gleaming in the Earth's yellow sunlight. They carried weapons that could level city blocks and personal shields that could deflect anything the humans might throw at them. Behind them came Zeth-Kari himself, his command armor making him tower above even his own troops. The humans' response was exactly what he had expected. Their military forces began to surround the park, but they kept their distance, clearly recognizing that they were outmatched. Aircraft circled overhead, keeping well out of range of the hegemony's defensive systems. News crews set up behind police barriers, their primitive recording devices capturing everything for broadcast to their global population. A delegation approached under a white flag led by what appeared to be human officials and military leaders. They looked exactly as the intelligence reports had described, small, weak, with only 2 arms and eyes positioned poorly for combat awareness. Their skin was pale and appeared fragile, and they moved with the hesitant gait of prey animals approaching a predator. "I am General Morrison, United States Army," announced the human in the lead, his voice steady despite the fear that was clearly evident in his body language. "I'm authorized to speak for the United Nations Security Council. We want to establish peaceful contact." Zeth-Kari's translation implant processed the human's words instantly. He looked down at the tiny creature, noting how the human's head barely reached the middle of his torso even when he wasn't wearing his armor. With the armor, the difference was even more pronounced. "I am Commander Zeth-Kari of the Hegemony 4th Assault Fleet," he replied, his voice amplified by his suit's speakers until it echoed across the park like thunder. "I am here to inform you that your world has been selected for incorporation into the Hegemony. You have 1 rotation of your planet to surrender unconditionally. Any resistance will be met with complete annihilation." The human delegation exchanged glances, their faces pale with fear. General Morrison stepped forward again, his hands held up in what Zeth-Kari recognized as a gesture of non-aggression. "Commander, surely we can negotiate terms. Humanity has much to offer in terms of trade, cultural exchange, scientific cooperation. We don't need to resort to conquest." Zeth-Kari's laughter was like the sound of grinding stone. "You have nothing we need, human. Your technology is obsolete, your culture is primitive, and your scientific achievements are infantile. You will serve the hegemony as workers and soldiers, nothing more. Consider it an honor. Most species we encounter are simply eliminated as too inferior to be useful." As he spoke, he noticed something strange happening around the edges of the park. Despite the military cordons and the obvious danger, civilians were gathering. Not just adults, but families, children. They were pointing at the hegemony forces with what appeared to be curiosity rather than fear. "Your people lack even basic survival instincts," he observed to the general. "They approach danger like foolish beasts. Commander, those are just citizens, families. They're not a threat to you. Nothing on this world is a threat to me," Zeth-Kari replied dismissively. "My armor has never been breached. My weapons have leveled mountains. Your entire military could not scratch the paint on my battlesuit." It was at that moment that he heard something that made him pause. Through the sound of wind, distant sirens, and helicopter rotors, he heard something completely unexpected. Laughter. High, bright, completely fearless laughter. He turned his massive head to locate the source and saw a small human child who had somehow slipped past the military barriers. She appeared to be very young, even by human standards, with long dark hair and bright, curious eyes. She was running directly toward him with the fearless abandon that only the very young possess. "Emma, get back here!" shouted a woman from behind the barriers, presumably the child's parent. "Emma!" But the child paid no attention to the calls. She ran right up to Zethkari and stopped just in front of his massive armored feet, tilting her head back to look up at him. Her neck had to crane at an almost impossible angle just to see his face behind the armor's helmet. "Wow," she said in her small, clear voice. "You're really big." "Are you a robot?" The entire delegation fell silent. The human military leaders looked horrified. General Morrison began to step forward, clearly intending to retrieve the child, but Zethkari held up one of his massive hands to stop him. "I am not a robot, small human," he said, his voice automatically modulating to a lower volume so as not to damage the child's hearing. "I am Commander Zethkari. I am here to conquer your world." Emma considered this for a moment, her head tilted to one side like a curious bird. "Why do you want to conquer us? Did we do something bad?" The question caught him completely off guard. In all his years of conquest, through 17 worlds and countless battles, no one had ever asked him why. They had begged, threatened, bargained, and fought, but none had ever simply asked why with such innocent curiosity. "It is what the hegemony does," he replied after a pause. "We bring order to chaos. We unite worlds under our rule." "But we're not chaos," Emma said reasonably. "We're just people. Look, I can show you." Before anyone could react, before any of the adults could intervene, the small child stepped forward and placed her tiny hand directly on his armored leg. And something impossible happened. Where her small palm touched the supposedly impenetrable armor, hairline cracks began to appear. Zethkari stared down in shock as the cracks spread outward from the point of contact, spider-webbing across the surface of armor that had never been damaged by any weapon in the galaxy. The metal forged in the heart of a dying star and blessed by ancient war gods began to fracture under the touch of a 7-year-old human child. "That's impossible," he whispered, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence that had fallen over the entire park. Emma looked up at him with concern. "Oh no, did I break it? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to break your costume. Mommy says I have to be more careful with my strength, but I forget sometimes." The cracks continued to spread, and through them, Zethkari could feel something he hadn't experienced in decades: vulnerability. The environmental seals of his armor were beginning to fail. The power systems were fluctuating. The weapon targeting systems were going offline, one by one, all from the gentle touch of a child who was now looking up at him with nothing but innocent concern for having accidentally damaged what she thought was simply an elaborate costume. For the first time in his military career, Commander Zethkari of the Hegemony 4th Assault Fleet felt a emotion he had thought himself incapable of experiencing: fear. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice was beginning to whisper that perhaps the intelligence reports about humanity had been very, very wrong. The cracks in Zethkari's armor continued to spread like ice breaking on a frozen lake, each new fracture accompanied by small sparks and the whine of failing systems. His heads-up display flickered and went dark. The environmental controls stuttered. Even his communication systems began to emit static as the integrity of the suit's housing was compromised. Emma stepped back, her small face scrunched up with worry. "I'm really sorry, mister. I really didn't mean to break your robot suit. My daddy says I need to remember that I'm stronger than other kids, but I always forget." The child's innocent apology sent a chill down Zethkari's spine that had nothing to do with the failing environmental systems. He looked around the park, suddenly seeing the gathered humans in a completely different light. They weren't cowering in fear as conquered populations usually did. Instead, they watched with a mixture of curiosity and concern, as if they were more worried about the child getting in trouble than about the massive alien invasion force that had just landed in their city. General Morrison stepped forward cautiously, his hands raised. "Emma, honey, you need to come back to your mother now." The commander might be hurt. Is he hurt? Emma asked, immediately turning back to Zethkari with genuine concern. I can kiss it better if you want. Mommy says my kisses make everything better. The offer to provide medical assistance in the form of a kiss from a small child would have been laughable under any other circumstances, but as Zethkari watched more systems fail throughout his armor, he began to realize that something fundamentally impossible was happening here. The armor was forged from hegemony steel, treated with quantum hardening, and blessed by war gods whose power had been tested across 1,000 worlds. Nothing should be able to damage it with casual contact, let alone a gentle touch from an unarmed child. How? He asked, his voice carrying a tremor that his troops had never heard before. How did you do this? Emma looked confused. Do what? I just touched you. I touch lots of things. My armor, Zethkari said slowly, trying to make his voice gentle despite the growing panic in his chest. My armor is the strongest thing in the galaxy. Nothing can break it. Nothing has ever even scratched it. Oh, Emma said, nodding seriously. Yeah, things break around me sometimes. Mommy says it's because I don't know my own strength yet. She says when I get bigger, I'll learn how to control it better. Lieutenant Vaxtul's voice crackled through the failing communication system. Commander, we're reading massive system failures in your armor. Should we engage defensive protocols? Negative, Zethkari replied quickly, his tactical mind racing despite his shock. If this child could damage his command armor with a touch, what might happen if his troops opened fire? What if their weapons simply shattered against whatever force field or energy matrix these humans possessed? Worse, what if the child decided to touch his weapons, or his ship, or his troops? He looked more carefully at the humans gathered around the park perimeter. They appeared completely normal by every metric his scanners could detect. Weak bone structure, limited muscle mass, no visible energy signatures, no technological augmentation. And yet this child had just accomplished something that should have been physically impossible. Emma, he said carefully, crouching down to bring himself closer to her height, though even crouching he still towered over her. Can other human children do what you just did? Emma shrugged, a gesture that somehow managed to be both innocent and terrifying. I guess so. Kids are pretty strong. My friend Jake can lift his dad's car when it gets stuck in the snow, and Sarah can run really fast, like faster than cars and stuff. But grown-ups are always telling us to be careful and not to break things. The implications hit Zethkari like a physical blow. If this child was representative of human capabilities, if human children routinely possess strength that could damage hegemony armor, then the intelligence reports hadn't just been wrong. They had been catastrophically, disastrously wrong. General Morrison, he said, turning to the human military leader, your children. Are they all like this? The general looked confused. Like what, Commander? This strong? This capable of damaging advanced technology? General Morrison glanced at Emma, then back at the alien commander. Well, kids can be pretty destructive if they put their minds to it. Emma's always been particularly strong for her age, but children don't usually encounter alien battle armor, so we don't really have a comparison point. Zethkari's mind was reeling. The humans seemed genuinely unaware that their offspring possessed capabilities that exceeded anything in the hegemony's experience. They spoke of children lifting vehicles and outrunning transportation as if these were minor behavioral quirks rather than demonstrations of superhuman ability. Your intelligence systems, he said slowly. When other species have visited your world, what reports did they file? The question seemed to confuse the humans even more. Commander, you're the first alien species we've encountered, at least the first to make open contact. That's impossible, Zethkari said automatically. The galaxy is filled with thousands of species. Survey teams, scouts, advanced reconnaissance groups. Someone must have visited your world before us. But even as he said it, a terrible suspicion began to form in his mind. What if other species had visited Earth? What if they had encountered humans, and particularly human children, and discovered what he was just now learning? What if those survey teams and reconnaissance groups had never reported back because they had never survived the encounter? Emma was looking up at his damaged armor with genuine distress. I really am sorry about your costume. Maybe my daddy can fix it? He's really good at fixing things. He fixed my bike when I accidentally squeezed the handlebars too hard. You squeezed metal handlebars too hard? Zethkari asked weakly. Uh-huh. I was excited because I saw a really pretty butterfly, and I squeezed too tight and they kind of crumpled up. But Daddy hammered them back out and now they're good as new. The casual mention of crumpling metal with excitement sent another wave of shock through the alien commander. He activated his suit's external scanners and focused them on the small child standing before him. The readings that came back made no sense whatsoever. According to his instruments, Emma was completely human. Normal bone density, normal muscle structure, normal energy output. By every measure his technology could detect, she was exactly what she appeared to be, a small, fragile child who should barely be able to lift objects her own size, let alone damage armor that could withstand direct hits from fusion weapons.
"Commander," came Lieutenant Vaxtool's voice through the static.
Long-range sensors are detecting approaching human military units. Significant numbers, sir. Zethkari looked around the park and saw that the lieutenant was correct. More human forces were arriving every minute. Tanks, aircraft, troops, and vehicles he didn't recognize. But now, instead of seeing a primitive military response that posed no threat, he saw something far more ominous. If the children possessed these impossible capabilities, what about the adults? What about trained human warriors? What if the approaching military forces included soldiers who had learned to harness whatever power allowed their children to damage hegemony armor with a touch? "Emma," he said urgently, "where are your parents?" "Mommy's right over there," Emma said, pointing toward the crowd of civilians behind the police barriers. "She's the one calling my name. She's probably worried because I'm not supposed to talk to strangers, but you seem nice." Zethkari looked in the direction Emma had pointed and saw a woman frantically waving and calling for the child to return. Like all the other humans he could see, she appeared completely normal. Weak, fragile, no visible augmentation or enhancement. And yet she had produced offspring capable of damaging technology that represented the pinnacle of hegemony engineering. "Emma, I need you to go back to your mother now," he said as gently as his massive voice would allow. "And I need you to tell her something very important. Can you do that for me?" "Sure," Emma said brightly. "What should I tell her?" "Tell her that the alien commander says that humans are much stronger than he thought. Tell her that he needs to talk to the smartest humans on your planet, and he needs to do it very carefully." Emma nodded solemnly as if committing the message to memory. Then she looked up at him with those bright, curious eyes. "Are you going to stay and be friends with us? I think you're really cool even if you are kind of scary looking." The innocent question struck Zethkari harder than any weapon ever had. This child who possessed power beyond his comprehension wanted to be friends. She had looked at his terrifying alien appearance, his massive size, his obvious status as a conqueror, and her first instinct had been curiosity and friendship. I don't know," he replied honestly. "That depends on whether your people and my people can understand each other." "Oh, we're really good at understanding," Emma assured him. "Humans are super good at making friends with people who are different. We have friends from all over the world, and they're all different colors and speak different languages and everything." As Emma skipped back toward her frantic mother, Zethkari remained crouched in the middle of Central Park, watching the most dangerous creature he had ever encountered disappear into a crowd of beings who seemed completely unaware of their own capabilities. His armor continued to fail around him, systems shutting down one by one. But for the first time in his military career, Commander Zethkari was beginning to suspect that armor might be irrelevant when dealing with humans. The real question was whether humanity's apparent innocence about their own power made them more dangerous or less dangerous than any species the hegemony had ever faced. Looking around at the gathering crowd of humans, all watching him with the same mixture of curiosity and concern that Emma had shown, Zethkari began to fear he was about to find out. 3 hours after Emma's innocent touch had shattered his worldview along with his armor, Zethkari found himself in an unprecedented situation. He was sitting across from a group of human leaders in what they called the United Nations building. His damaged battlesuit powered down to prevent further system failures. The emergency repairs his technicians had made were holding, but barely. What disturbed him most wasn't the damage to his equipment, it was the growing realization that humanity had been deliberately hiding their true capabilities from the rest of the galaxy. Dr. Sarah Chen, a human xenobiologist who had been hastily assembled as part of the diplomatic team, was explaining human development to him in terms that made his situation seem increasingly hopeless. "You have to understand, Commander, children don't typically know their own strength," she was saying, her tone patient but with an underlying edge that hadn't been there when the meeting began. "We spend years teaching them to be gentle, to control their impulses, to interact safely with their environment." "Dr. Chen," Zethkari interrupted, his voice carefully modulated, "my armor can withstand direct hits from plasma cannons. Your child damaged it with casual contact. This is not simply a matter of not knowing one's own strength." The human diplomats exchanged glances that Zethkari was beginning to interpret as significant. There was something they weren't telling him, something important. His training in reading enemy psychology was finally beginning to penetrate the humans' deceptively open behavior. President Sarah Williams, the elected leader of what humans called the United States, leaned forward in her chair. "Commander, we need to establish some ground rules before this conversation continues. You came here with the intention of conquering our world. That creates a rather hostile foundation for diplomacy." "Madam President," Zethkari replied carefully, "I am beginning to suspect that conquest was never a realistic option." "No," she agreed quietly. "It wasn't." The simple admission sent a chill through Zethkari's massive frame. The humans weren't denying their capabilities, they weren't pretending to be weak. They were simply acknowledging that his invasion had been doomed from the start. General Morrison activated a holographic display showing global military positions. "Commander, when your ship entered our atmosphere, we had approximately 14 minutes to prepare a response. We chose not to engage immediately because we wanted to understand your intentions." "You chose," Zethkari repeated slowly. "You're saying you could have engaged." "Commander," Dr. Chen interjected, "may I ask what your intelligence reports told you about human military capabilities?" Zethkari accessed his suit's database, though many systems were still offline from Emma's encounter. "Your most advanced weapons are chemical propellant firearms and basic energy weapons. Your aircraft are chemical-fueled and subsonic. Your space presence is minimal and primitive. Your defensive capabilities are limited to basic missile systems and energy shields around major population centers." The silence that followed his recitation was somehow more ominous than any threat could have been. "Commander," President Williams said gently, "who provided these intelligence reports? Hegemony survey teams, advanced scouts, reconnaissance drones? Standard pre-conquest intelligence gathering? When was the last time a hegemony team successfully left Earth's solar system after gathering intelligence?" The question hit Zethkari like a physical blow. He began accessing his suit's historical databases, searching for records of successful Earth reconnaissance missions. What he found made his blood run cold. No hegemony team had ever filed a complete intelligence report on Earth and subsequently returned to hegemony space. The intelligence he had been given was based entirely on long-range observations and extrapolations from human radio and television broadcasts. "You've been intercepting our scout teams," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Commander," General Morrison said, his tone still respectful but with an underlying firmness, "Earth has been aware of alien surveillance for approximately 40 Earth years. We've been very careful about what information we allow to be transmitted off-world." Dr. Chen pulled up another holographic display, this one showing what appeared to be a timeline. "We've had contact with 17 different species over the past 4 decades. Most were simply curious about us. A few were hostile. Some were traders looking for new markets. All were handled quietly to avoid global panic." "Handled," Zethkari repeated. "Handled," President Williams confirmed. "Some were welcomed as friends and trading partners. Others were politely discouraged from pursuing contact. A few required more direct intervention. The implications were staggering. Humanity wasn't a primitive species that had barely reached their own moon. They were a spacefaring civilization that had been carefully controlling their contact with galactic civilization for decades. and they had been doing it so effectively that the hegemony's intelligence apparatus had never detected their true capabilities. "The children?" Zethkari said suddenly. "When your children interact with alien technology, what typically happens?" Dr. Chen smiled, and for the first time, Zethkari saw something predatory in the expression. "Commander, human children are naturally curious. When they encounter alien devices, they tend to examine them very thoroughly. Sometimes the devices stop working properly afterward. You're saying human children have been disabling our reconnaissance equipment. We're saying that alien technology seems to have difficulty functioning properly around human children," General Morrison corrected. "We're not entirely sure why. Children have always been stronger than they look, faster than they should be, more resilient than seems possible. We assumed it was normal until we began encountering other species who were surprised by these capabilities." President Williams activated another display, this one showing a star map with marked territories. "Commander, the hegemony controls approximately 47 solar systems, according to our intelligence." Zethkari nodded, wondering how humans had acquired that information. "Humanity currently maintains diplomatic or trade relationships with over 200 species across 73 star systems," she continued. "We've been part of galactic civilization longer than the hegemony has existed. We simply choose to keep a low profile." The revelations were coming too fast for Zethkari to process. Everything he thought he knew about human civilization was wrong. They weren't primitive, they weren't isolated, they weren't weak. Why, he asked? Why maintain the deception? Why allow the galaxy to believe you're primitive? Chen exchanged glances with the other human leaders before answering. "Commander, how many worlds has the hegemony conquered through force?" 17. Zethkari replied automatically. "And how many species has the hegemony eliminated entirely because they were considered too dangerous to allow to exist?" The question struck too close to home. "That information is classified. We know about the Virax Unity. We know about the dozen other species that the hegemony wiped out because they posed potential threats to hegemony expansion." Zethkari felt his armor's remaining systems surge as his stress levels spiked. The humans knew about classified hegemony military operations going back centuries. They knew about decisions that were made at the highest levels of command, decisions that were never supposed to leave the hegemony's most secure facilities. "You have spies in our command structure," he said. "Commander," General Morrison replied, "we have friends in your command structure, hegemony citizens who believe that conquest and genocide are not the only ways to interact with other species." The meeting room fell silent as the full scope of humanity's deception became clear. They weren't victims of an alien invasion. They were a spacefaring power that had been manipulating galactic politics for decades, carefully controlling information about their capabilities while building relationships with species across the galaxy. "What do you want?" Zethkari asked finally. President Williams leaned back in her chair. "That depends on you, Commander. You came here to conquer us, but conquest is no longer possible. The question is, what happens next?" "My fleet," Zethkari said. "My orders were to report back within 7 days. Your fleet is currently surrounded by ships from 12 different allied species," General Morrison informed him. "They're not in immediate danger, but they're also not leaving the solar system until this situation is resolved." Dr. Chen pulled up a final holographic display, this one showing Zethkari's own ship surrounded by vessels of various alien designs. "Commander, you have a choice to make. You can attempt to complete your mission, in which case you and your crew will not survive to report your failure. Or you can become part of the solution to a problem the galaxy doesn't yet know it has." "What problem?" "The hegemony," President Williams said simply. "Commander, your government has made enemies across the galaxy, species that you've conquered, species that you've threatened, species that you've eliminated. They're organizing, and when they move against the hegemony, it's going to be a war unlike anything the galaxy has ever seen." Zethkari looked around the room at the human faces watching him. Emma's innocent curiosity had led him to this moment, where everything he thought he knew about the galaxy had been turned upside down. "And humanity? We're going to help them win," Dr. Chen said quietly. unless you give us a reason to help the hegemony instead. For the first time in his military career, Commander Zethkari began to understand that the strongest armor in the galaxy wasn't made of metal and energy shields. It was made of friends. The weight of impossible choices pressed down on Zethkari as he stood on the observation deck of his damaged ship 12 hours later. Through the transparent aluminum viewports, he could see the alien fleet that had quietly surrounded his forces. Ships from species he recognized and others he had never encountered before, all of them waiting to see what decision he would make. His second-in-command, Lieutenant Vaxthal, approached cautiously. The lieutenant's armor showed stress fractures around the joints where young human hands had helped him off his transport ship earlier that day. A group of human children, supervised by their parents, had been allowed to visit the hegemony troops as what the humans called a goodwill gesture. What the humans had failed to mention was that their children's idea of helping involved physically lifting fully armored hegemony soldiers to help them down from vehicles that were designed to be exited using powered systems. "Commander," Vaxthal said, his voice carrying a tremor that Zethkari had never heard before, "the crew is concerned. The humans have invited us to something called a barbecue tomorrow. The children seemed particularly excited about showing us their playground. The thought of hegemony assault troopers being subjected to whatever a human playground might involve was almost enough to make Zethkari laugh if the situation weren't so dire. Sir," Vaxthal continued, "I've been analyzing our tactical situation. If the intelligence briefings we received were accurate, we should have conquered this world in approximately 6 hours. Instead, we're effectively prisoners. Our armor is failing from casual contact with their offspring, and they're treating us like honored guests. What's your assessment, Lieutenant?"
"Sir, I believe we may have significantly underestimated the humans."
"The understatement of the galactic cycle," Zethkari thought grimly. Through the viewport, he could see human children playing in the park where his ship had landed. They were running faster than his armor sensors could track, jumping higher than should have been physically possible, and playing games that seemed to involve casually throwing objects that should have been too heavy for them to lift. And their parents watched all of this as if it were completely normal. Dr. Chen had spent the afternoon providing what she called cultural orientation to his crew. The orientation had included a demonstration by a 10-year-old human boy named Marcus, who had politely asked if he could examine one of their shuttlecraft. When granted permission, he had picked up the entire vehicle and carefully rotated it to look at the landing gear. The shuttle weighed 47 tons. Marcus had lifted it with the same casual effort that Zethkari might use to examine a small tool. "Commander," Vaxthal said quietly, "there's something else. I've been reviewing our historical databases, cross-referencing every mention of human contact with other species. And, sir, the hegemony isn't the first civilization to make this mistake. The Zephrani Empire sent a conquest fleet to Earth approximately 80 years ago. They had complete orbital superiority, advanced weapons, overwhelming technological advantage." Zethkari turned from the viewport to face his lieutenant. "What happened to them?" "According to the records we've been able to access, the Zephrani fleet simply disappeared. No distress calls, no wreckage, no survivors. The Empire classified it as a navigation error and never investigated further. But, sir, I found similar incidents involving at least 6 other aggressive species over the past century. All sent fleets to Earth, none ever reported back. All were written off as equipment failures or navigational errors." The implications sent a chill down Zethkari's spine. Humanity hadn't just been hiding their capabilities from the galaxy. They had been systematically eliminating threats while maintaining the illusion of primitive helplessness. A soft chime indicated that someone was requesting permission to board his ship. The communications system displayed a familiar human face, Emma, the 7-year-old who had started this entire revelation with her innocent touch. "Commander," came Emma's voice through the speakers. "Can I come visit your spaceship? Mommy says I should ask permission first." Behind Emma, Zethkari could see Dr. Brett Chen and what appeared to be Emma's parents. The adults were smiling, but there was something in their expressions that suggested this wasn't simply a social visit. "Permission granted," Zethkari replied, though every instinct screamed at him to refuse. Emma arrived on the bridge, accompanied by Dr. Chen and a man and woman who introduced themselves as her parents. The child looked around the ship with the same bright curiosity she had shown in the park, but this time her parents were watching her carefully. "Wow," Emma said, looking up at the displays and control systems that surrounded them. "Your spaceship is really pretty. It's all sparkly and glowy." "Thank you," Zethkari replied, unsure of the appropriate protocol for accepting compliments from potentially dangerous children. Emma's father, Dr. James Chen, apparently related to Dr. Sarah Chen, stepped forward. "Commander, we thought it might be helpful for you to understand something about Emma specifically. She's not entirely typical, even by human standards."
In what way? Emma's mother, Dr.
Lisa Chen smiled at her daughter fondly. "Emma, show the commander your special talent." Emma looked around the bridge, her gaze settling on a damaged control console that had been offline since her initial contact with Zethkari's armor. She walked over to it and placed her small hands on the surface. "I can sometimes fix things when they're broken," she explained, her voice taking on the serious tone children use when discussing something important. "Daddy says I can see how things are supposed to work and help them remember." Under her touch, the console began to glow. Lights that had been dark for hours flickered to life. Displays that had shown nothing but static began showing clear readouts. Systems that Zethkari's engineers had declared irreparable began functioning normally. "That's impossible," Lieutenant Vaxtool whispered. "No, Doctor." Sarah Chen said quietly, "That's Emma. She doesn't just break things accidentally. She can fix them, too. It's just that fixing usually requires understanding what went wrong first." Emma stepped back from the console, looking pleased with herself. "There. It was just confused about which parts were supposed to connect to which other parts. I helped it remember." Zethkari stared at the fully functional console, his mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. The child hadn't used tools, hadn't input commands, hadn't even understood the technology. She had simply touched it and somehow restored systems that represented centuries of advanced engineering. "Commander," Emma said, turning to face him with those impossibly bright eyes. "Doctor, Sarah says you're worried about whether your people and our people can be friends. Is that right?"
"Yes, Seth," Kari replied honestly.
"That's right. Can I show you something that might help?" Before he could respond, Emma reached out and gently touched his armor again. This time, instead of the spreading cracks that had terrified him in the park, he felt something entirely different. The damaged systems began to restore themselves. The environmental controls stabilized. The communication systems cleared. Even the quantum processors that powered his weapons targeting systems began functioning at peak efficiency. But more than that, he could feel something else, a sense of connection. As if Emma's touch had somehow linked him to something larger than himself. For just a moment, he could sense the thoughts and feelings of every human on the planet below. Their hopes, their fears, their genuine desire to find peaceful solutions to conflicts that seemed impossible to resolve. And underneath it all, he could feel their strength. Not just the physical power that allowed their children to damage hegemony armor and lift vehicles, but something deeper. A resilience that had carried them through millennia of their own conflicts, a creativity that had found solutions to problems others had declared unsolvable, and a capacity for friendship that had built alliances across dozens of star systems. Emma stepped back, and the sensation faded, but the memory of it remained. "We don't want to fight anybody," she said simply, "but we're really good at protecting our friends, and we have lots and lots of friends." Zethkari looked around his bridge at the faces watching him. His own crew still shaken by their encounters with human children, the human diplomats waiting to see what choice he would make, and Emma, a 7-year-old child who somehow embodied the potential for peace and the promise of protection in equal measure.
Dr.
Chen, he said finally, addressing Emma's father. "You said Emma wasn't typical, even by human standards. What makes her special?" "Emma represents humanity's next generation," Dr. James Chen replied. "Children born after we began our contact with other species. They're stronger, faster, more intuitive about technology than previous generations. and more importantly, they're naturally inclined toward building connections rather than barriers. There are others like her, Commander, Dr. Sarah Chen interjected. There are approximately 2 billion children on Earth right now. Emma is remarkable, but she's not unique. 2 billion. 2 billion human children with capabilities that exceeded anything in the hegemony's experience. Children who could disable equipment with curiosity and repair it with compassion. Children who saw differences as opportunities for friendship rather than threats to be eliminated. What do you want from me? Zethkari asked. We want you to choose, Emma said, her small voice carrying surprising authority. You can go back to your people and tell them that Earth is too dangerous to attack. Or you can stay and help us show them that there's a better way to explore the galaxy than conquering everyone you meet.
And if I choose the first option, then you and your crew will be allowed to leave safely, Doctor.
Sarah Chan assured him. Your ship will be repaired, your supplies will be restocked, and you'll be given safe passage out of the system. But the next hegemony fleet that comes here won't be as fortunate. And if I choose the second option? Emma smiled at him. The same bright, fearless smile that had started this entire adventure. Then you get to help us make the galaxy a better place. And maybe your people can learn that being strong doesn't always mean being scary. Standing on his bridge, surrounded by the impossible children and determined adults of humanity, Zethkari finally understood why no conquest fleet had ever returned from Earth. They hadn't been destroyed, they had been converted. And as he looked down at Emma's expectant face, he realized that he was about to become the latest example of humanity's most dangerous weapon. Hope. 6 months later, Zethkari stood in what humans called the UN Assembly Hall, but which now served as the primary meeting chamber for the Galactic Cooperative Council. The irony was not lost on him that the species he had once considered primitive now hosted diplomatic sessions involving over 300 different civilizations. The transformation had been remarkable, both personal and galactic. His own armor, completely restored by Emma's touch, now bore new inscriptions alongside the names of conquered worlds. These new markings told a different story: worlds liberated from hegemony control, species freed from oppression, and alliances forged through cooperation. Rather than conquest, today marked a special occasion. The Hegemony High Command had agreed to attend peace negotiations, the first such talks in their species' recorded history. The irony that these negotiations were being mediated by humans, the same species they had planned to conquer, was a source of considerable discussion among the gathered delegates. Emma, now 8 years old and somehow even more formidable than before, she had become something of a celebrity among the galactic community, not for her remarkable abilities, but for her uncanny talent at helping hostile species find common ground. Over the past 6 months, she had personally mediated disputes between the crystalline Vorthak and the energy-based Luminary, helped the warrior caste Thraxians understand the peaceful philosophy of the plant-like Verdani, and somehow convinced the notoriously xenophobic Kethmori to join a cultural exchange program. Her method was always the same. She would approach the most intimidating representatives from each species and ask them to explain why they were angry. Then she would listen with the serious attention that only children could muster, ask clarifying questions that adults would never think to ask, and somehow help each side understand that their fears were often based on misunderstandings rather than fundamental incompatibilities. Commander Zethkari, announced Secretary General Williams from the podium, please present your assessment of the hegemony's position. Zethkari activated his personal holographic display showing a star map that would have been classified as top secret just months ago. The hegemony's territory was marked in red, surrounded by an ever-growing network of allied systems marked in blue and green. Honorable delegates, he began, his voice carrying clearly through the Assembly Hall's translation systems, the Hegemony High Command has reviewed our strategic position following 6 months of conflict with the Galactic Cooperative Council. Our assessment is that continued hostilities serve no logical purpose. Murmurs of surprise rippled through the assembly. The hegemony had never admitted to anything approaching defeat before. Our intelligence indicates that 37 of our former tributary worlds have declared independence and joined the Cooperative Council. 14 additional worlds under hegemony control have experienced what our analysts term peaceful insurrections, organized by local resistance movements with council support. Our ability to maintain control through force has been effectively neutralized. Admiral Thraxnell, the hegemony's chief military strategist who had arrived just that morning, rose from his seat in the diplomatic section. His armor was even more imposing than Zethkari's had been, covered in inscriptions documenting a career of conquest spanning 2 centuries. "Commander Zethkari," he said, his voice carrying the cold authority of supreme military command, "you have provided the High Command with reports that strain credibility. You claim that human children possess capabilities that exceed our best military technology. You assert that species we considered inferior have formed an alliance capable of challenging hegemony supremacy. Most incredulously, you suggest that this Earth serves as the coordinating center for galactic resistance to our rightful authority." The silence in the assembly hall was profound. Every delegate understood that this moment would determine whether the negotiations would continue or whether the galaxy would face a war unlike any in its history. Emma stood up from her seat in the front row. At barely 4 feet tall, she should have been insignificant compared to the massive alien beings surrounding her. Instead, every eye in the assembly focused on her as she walked to the center of the chamber. "Admiral Thraxnell," she said, her clear voice carrying easily through the vast space. "Commander Zethkari told us that you're the strongest warrior in the hegemony. Is that true?" The admiral looked down at the small human child with obvious contempt. "I am the supreme military commander of the most powerful civilization in the galaxy, young creature. I have conquered more worlds than your species has years of recorded history." Emma nodded seriously, as if considering this information carefully. "That means you've hurt a lot of people." "I have eliminated obstacles to hegemony expansion," the admiral replied coldly. "Weak species that serve no purpose except to occupy useful worlds." "That's really sad," Emma said, and somehow her simple statement carried more weight than any military threat could have. "It must be lonely to think that the only way to be safe is to hurt everyone who's different from you." "I do not require the sympathy of primitives," Admiral Thraxnell growled, his forearms moving to rest on the weapons at his belt. Emma stepped closer to him, showing the same fearless curiosity that had begun this entire transformation 6 months ago. "Can I show you something, Admiral? Something that might help you understand why we don't need to be enemies." "Child, you will maintain appropriate distance from—" Emma reached out and gently touched the Admiral's armored leg just as she had with Zethkari in Central Park. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Cracks appeared in armor that was supposed to be impervious to any weapon in the galaxy. Warning lights began flashing across his suit systems. Environmental controls started failing one by one. But this time, Zethkari knew what was really happening. Emma wasn't just damaging the Admiral's equipment, she was creating an opportunity for connection. "I can feel how scared you are," Emma said softly, her hand still resting on the fracturing armor. "You're scared that if you stop fighting, someone will hurt your people the way you've been hurting other people." "But Admiral, that's not how friendship works." Through the failing armor, Admiral Thraxnell was experiencing what Zethkari had felt months before. The sensation of being connected to something larger than himself, the overwhelming sense of humanity's collective desire for peace, and the remarkable strength that came from alliances built on trust rather than fear. But Emma wasn't done. Her touch was somehow allowing the Admiral to experience more than just human thoughts and feelings. He was sensing the perspectives of every species represented in the assembly hall. The deep, slow thoughts of the Verdani, who measured time in centuries and valued growth over conquest. The crystalline harmonies of the Vorthak, whose entire civilization was based on resonance and cooperation. The fierce but protective instincts of the Thraxians, who fought only to defend those they considered family. "This is impossible," Admiral Thraxnell whispered, his voice carrying a tremor that no hegemony soldier had ever heard from their supreme commander. "No," Emma replied gently. "This is normal. This is what it feels like when people care about each other instead of trying to control each other." She stepped back, and the Admiral's armor began to repair itself just as Zethkari's had. But the real repair was happening inside the massive alien warrior as he struggled to process the experience of feeling genuine care and protection from species he had spent his career viewing as enemies or obstacles. Secretary General Williams stepped forward from the podium. Admiral Threxnell, you now understand why 37 worlds have chosen to leave the hegemony. They've experienced what you just felt. The question is, what will you do with this knowledge? The Admiral looked around the assembly hall, seeing for the first time not enemies or subordinates, but beings with their own hopes, fears, and dreams. His gaze settled on Emma, who was watching him with the same patient curiosity she showed to everyone. "Child," he said slowly, "what you have shown me, is this how all humans experience the galaxy?" Emma shrugged, a gesture that somehow managed to be both innocent and profound. "I guess so. We just try to understand how other people feel and then figure out how to help everyone be happy." "And if others refuse to cooperate, if they insist on conquest and domination?" Emma's expression grew serious. "Then we protect our friends, all of them, no matter what it takes." The simple statement carried implications that made Admiral Threxnell look around the assembly hall with new eyes. These weren't just individual species that had formed a loose alliance. They were all friends of humanity, which meant they were all protected by beings who could disable hegemony armor with a touch and repair impossible damage through compassion. Activating his communication system to contact the hegemony leadership directly, "I recommend immediate cessation of all hostile operations and acceptance of the Cooperative Council's terms for peace negotiations." "Admiral," came the reply from across the galaxy, "what is your assessment of the tactical situation?" Admiral Threxnell looked down at Emma, who smiled up at him with the radiant confidence of a child who had never doubted that even the scariest monsters could become friends.
"High Command," he replied, "I assess that we have been attempting to conquer people who are significantly stronger than us, significantly kinder than us, and significantly more capable of building lasting alliances than us. I recommend that we ask them to teach us how to be better neighbors." The assembly hall erupted in cheers from hundreds of different species, creating a symphony of sounds that had never been heard before in galactic history. But the sound that mattered most to Zeth Kari was Emma's delighted laughter as she realized that another friend had been made. Later, as delegates from across the galaxy celebrated the end of the hegemony wars, Zeth Kari found himself standing with Emma on the observation deck of what had once been his invasion ship and was now his diplomatic vessel. "Emma," he said, "can I ask you something?" "Sure. When you touch our armor and it breaks, you're not really breaking it, are you? You're showing us that we don't need it anymore." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "Armor is for when you're scared and alone. But when you have friends, you don't need to be scared anymore." Looking out at the vast armada of ships from hundreds of different worlds all working together to build something better than any of them could create alone, Zeth Kari finally understood the greatest lesson humanity had to teach the galaxy. The strongest armor was the kind you never had to wear. Because when you had friends like these, no one could ever make you fight alone. And somewhere in the assembly hall below, Admiral Threxnell was learning the same lesson Emma had taught to every species she encountered, that the scariest monsters often turned out to be the loneliest people, and that the right kind of friendship could heal wounds that no amount of armor could protect against. The galaxy would never be the same, and for the first time in its history, that was a very good thing. He thought Earth was weak. Then a human child cracked his battlesuit, HFY, Sci-F,